All right, thank you so much, Susan, and thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. Before we get started, I want to have everyone here in the room introduce themselves. And Susan already introduced herself, but anything else to share, Susan?
Nope, just Susan Kaniga, Data Governance, and
that's good.
Kim Stansager, Performance Management, OSPI.
Lane Cisco with Student Information at OSPI.
Andrew Parr, staff to the State Board of Education.
Nathan Olson, Communications Director. And Joshua Lynch, Program Supervisor for Discipline and Behavior.
Excellent. And I'm Callie Sechrist with the Equity and Civil Rights Office here at OSPI. So in today's webinar, we will be covering 4 main areas. First, we will be building some context for why OSPI is reporting student discipline data. Next, we will give a brief overview of the highlights of the data. We'll cover some of the new features of the analytic tool that we are now using. And finally, we'll be sharing some student discipline updates and resources. So before we get into the data, I'd like to start with OSPI's vision, which is to prepare every student for career, college, and life. To make that a reality, we need to make sure that every student across their state has equal access to a high-quality education. So when we think about student discipline, OSPI is dedicated to helping schools find positive approaches to student discipline so that we can better serve each and every student and make sure each student has an equal chance to succeed and be ready for career, college, and life. So from OSPI's vision come OSPI's performance indicators, which include helping students avoid suspensions and expulsions.
And just to provide a little context for why OSPI reports this data, there is, in a limited sense, a requirement for OSPI to publicly make this data available, and that's been in statute since 2013. However, in the grander scheme of things, in the larger sense of why we report this data, it's about providing an equity lens, transparency, accountability, and supporting the capacity for OSPI as well as districts to engage in data-formed approaches in a process of continuous improvement in discipline, as well as in alignment with other performance indicators and a focus and an inquiry that may be intersectional as far as discipline and attendance, or discipline and 9th grade course failure, or any of the other performance indicators. So we encourage districts, when they approach these performance indicators, to not necessarily view them independent of each other, and to kind of start from one place and go from there, and ask yourselves questions like, how are my students doing? Where does our district fit in with other districts in the state, and especially districts that are like ours as far as proportionality and student subgroups? Who else needs to know this information, and how can we use these analytics to monitor our performance and improve? OSPI emphasizes in their equity and student discipline group a data-informed decision-making process, so the Plan, Do, Study, Act, and that involves analyzing the data, identifying root causes, deciding on a plan and implementing it, evaluating and monitoring how that plan is going, and then adjusting your plan if necessary to make changes to improve. OSPI's Discipline Equity Initiative is committed to supporting schools and communities in using this data to identify disparities in the use of out-of-school suspensions and expulsions, and to implement practices that promote equity and discipline and keep students in school. So as we've already said, this data should help schools and help districts and those involved in the community in determining what the root causes are and informing changes to policies and practices that will improve outcomes for students in behavior and discipline. The goals is to reduce the overall use of out-of-school suspension and expulsion while also closing the gap and eliminating disparities in the use of out-of-school suspension and expulsion. And later on in the presentation and looking at the data, we'll get into what that means.
Thank you, Josh. Finding effective alternatives to suspension and expulsion can improve learning and promote positive school climates for all students, not just those students who are being suspended or expelled. This is because research shows that out-of-school suspensions are linked to course failure, lower attendance, and dropping out, as well as lower school-wide academic achievement. For example, research shows an association between higher suspension rates and lower school-wide academic achievement and standardized test scores. High rates of suspension and expulsion can be indicative of the overall school climate and can erode trust between students and school staff. It's no surprise that out-of-school suspensions and expulsions can impact the academic performance of the students who have been suspended as well. Students who are suspended or expelled from school may be unsupervised during daytime hours, might not be able to benefit from the instruction that's being provided in school because they're out of school, not able to benefit from positive peer interactions and adult mentorship offered in school and in their classrooms. Suspending students can also fail to help students develop the skills and strategies they need to improve their behavior and avoid future problems. Furthermore, students of color and students with disabilities are disproportionately impacted by the use of suspensions and expulsions, which gives rise to concerns about whether we're providing equal opportunities for all students. So if we think back to OSPI's vision, which is to provide every student the opportunity to be ready for career, college, and life, this is particularly important. To address these concerns, schools are required under the Washington Administrative Code to annually review disaggregated student discipline data to identify and address disparities and make sure they are not the result of discrimination. To help school districts start this process, OSPI has developed these analytics to help school districts really dig into their data and identify, for example, how many students are suspended or expelled within their district and across the state. Who are those students by student group, for example, by race, sex, disability? How long are they removed from school and for what behaviors? This is really just the start of the data that schools should be looking into. Districts using their own student information systems can dig deeper into their data to identify disparities by individual schools, grade levels, and classrooms to start to uncover the root causes of their discipline disparities or rates of suspensions or expulsions. So what do these data show at the statewide level?
Before we get into this, I should just mention that the press release for the release of this discipline data went out before we started this webinar, and the tool itself is actually accessible. That was made live before we started this webinar as well. So once we get into the tool, those of you who have computers and want to can follow along and look at the tool as we do here through the webinar. So in Washington State for the last school year, the discipline rate, for the 2015-16 school year, the overall discipline rate was 3.7, and that means that 3.7 of all students in Washington were suspended or expelled at least once. And that amounts to 42,581 students in total who received at least one suspension or expulsion in the 2015-16 school year. However, as you'll see in the tool when we get into it, when you break that down by districts, there's a lot of variance in the rate. So we're just going to go into the tool now and show you a little bit about how you can start to look at the differences in rates by school district. Before we go into the tool, I just want to start on the home page so that those of you who maybe are trying to get in there yourself can follow along how you get there from OSPI's homepage. So if you just go to k12.wa.us, this will be the landing site. You'll want to navigate over to the tab that says K12 Data and Reports and click on that. And then on this page, you'll just scroll down to where it says OSPI Performance Indicators, Data and Analytics. click on that link, and it will take you to the home page for all of the OSPI performance indicators, including discipline. And the quick way to get to the discipline is to click on the tab here, and voila, there we are. So the discipline data files is the Tableau tool that we're going to be showing you today. And prior to this release, all of the discipline data was available in Excel files. So Susan later is going to explain some of the new features in this tool. But if you click on that, it takes you to the tool itself, and this main page here is where we see that state average of 3.7 that we were talking about, and that's for the 2015-16 school year. What you see along that line is where all of the districts, all 295 school districts within the state of Washington fall along that line and their average. So if you scroll over each dot, you'll see what appears in a box is the average for that state, for that district within the state. And part of the tool and features that I won't go into too much detail is you can filter by, for example, district enrollment size and compare among districts of 5,000 students or less, for example, by percentage of low income, English learners, special education, and see where rates between like districts fall along the spectrum of things. So the statewide discipline rate is decreasing. The overall discipline rate for the prior school year was 3.9, which amounts to a 5% decrease, or 1,804 fewer students receiving a suspension or expulsion in the 15-16 school year than in the 2014-15 school year. What you'll see when we go back into the tool is that not only are we looking at overall suspensions and expulsions, but we can break it down and look at long-term suspension, short-term suspension, and expulsion. So where we saw the most significant decreases in the use of suspensions and expulsions between the school year, the 2 school years, was with the use of long-term suspensions and expulsions. And we'll go into the tool again and show you how you can access that data and provide a clearer picture of what that looks like. So back to the main landing page for the tool. You'll notice at the top here that there's tabs. And the one we're going to go to right now is called the Gap tab. You'll see here again, the default is to the overall state rate. So this is showing longitudinally from 2012-13 school year up until the 15-16 school year, the state level discipline rate. And this is for all out of school suspension and expulsion. But if you go to this tab for select exclusion type, you can scroll down, and for example, I mentioned that long-term suspensions have seen a significant decrease. When you click on that, you'll see the decline in the use of long-term suspensions over the course of the last few school years. And the same with expulsions. So there's that drop that we were showing in the PowerPoint. And we'll get into some of the other features as far as what we're looking at now is all students, and we'll show you how to break that down by different groups of students as well as by different behavior types.
And Kelly and Josh, we did have a question come in. Are Asian students considered students of color in the category when we said that they were disproportionately affected by disciplinary action?
So we will have some time later in the webinar to talk about different student groups, and we can see based on different behavior types where different student groups fall within that. Part of part of the disparities exists when we break out different Asian categories of students, or different, so if we separate out, Native American and other Pacific Islander students compared to Asian students. So we'll look more at that in a couple slides.
Okay, thank you.
So just another view here is this page is looking at a percentage change in the rate, and then this one is showing the percentage point difference between the school years that I had just showed you in the analytics tool. While that's great news, as we mentioned at the beginning, we're not just concerned about overall decreases in suspension and expulsion rates as much as closing gaps between groups of students and how they're impacted by the use of suspensions and expulsions within schools. So while we've seen an overall decline in the rate, what we do continue to see over the last several years and into this last current set of data is that racial disparities and disparities by other student groups continue in the data. And Callie will talk more about that.
All right, thank you, Josh. So let's take a look at the tool and how you can view this data that we are looking at. Okay, so now we are back to the Tableau tool here on the website. And we are on the Gap tab here at the top. And now let's look at any exclusion type. So going back to any which is inclusive of any short-term, long-term suspension or expulsion. And under student group, just right here, you can select different groups of students. So let's select race, for example. This will show you the same screen that we had on the PowerPoint earlier. And this is where you can see the disparities and gaps between student groups. This is for all suspensions and expulsions, including all behavior types. This is also, I know there's a question before regarding students of color and what that is inclusive of. So I encourage you to take a look at the different student groups here, and you can see that we do have different categories broken down. So we have Asian students represented here, separate from Native, Hawaiian, and other Pacific Islander students. And you can compare discipline rates there. So if we scroll back up to the top, we can select another student group, for example, low-income students. And you can see where gaps and disparities persist there as well. So there are a few different ways to identify and measure disproportionality in student discipline. One way is to compare the discipline rates between student groups, which is what that last chart just showed. We can also look at that by going into the tool and looking at the district detail tab. I will show you another way to compare discipline rates in the tool. Okay, so this is the gap tab, which shows trend data, so data between 2012 and 13 through 2015-16 and where the gaps are. If we go into the district detail tab, we can look more closely at the discipline rates by student group across the state and for a particular district, including the number of students represented within those discipline rates. So this is the section that's comparing all other subgroups. So for example, students in special education and students not in special education, homeless students and students who are not homeless, male students and female students, for example, and you can compare the discipline rate. So for example, for students who are not in special education, the discipline rate you can see here is 3% for the state, compared to students who are in special education who have a discipline rate of 7.5%. If you scroll to the top here, you can also select race and ethnicity to compare discipline rates among the racial and ethnic categories. You can also select different school years. So this is 2015-16 school year, but you can also select by district as well as different behavior types, which we'll talk about a little bit more in a minute. The other way to look at disproportionality through these analytics is by looking at composition index, which compares student discipline by group to their respective enrollment. Composition index measures whether students are suspended at a rate proportionate to their representation in the total student population. The closer the composition index is to 1, the more proportionate the discipline rate is for that specific group. The numbers greater than 1 indicate that that group makes up more suspensions and expulsions than their representation in the student population. So let's take a look at the composition index tab in the analytic tool.
And while Callie is dialing that up here, are there any questions about what she just said about the composition index? Does that make sense?
I will also give a couple examples when we go into the composition index tab, which might help us understand what the number 1 really means when we're talking about composition index. Okay, so here we're in the analytic tool. There's a tab here that says composition index. And the groups that we're looking at here under this dropdown is race and ethnicity. So let's take a look at the composition index here. So if you remember, I said a composition index of 1 means that the suspension rate for that particular group, or the percentage of suspensions for that particular group, is proportionate to their representation in the total school population. So this line here represents a composition index of 1. So the closer the composition index is to 1, the more proportionate the discipline is for that particular group, given how they're represented in the overall school population. So here's an example. If we look at our Hispanic and Latino students, their composition index is just over 1, so it's very close to 1. And the reason it's a 1 is because, as you can see in these numbers over here, 22.7% of all students in the state are Hispanic or Latino. So that's the percent of enrolled students in the state. And if we look at all suspensions and expulsions, 26% of all suspensions or expulsions are students who are Hispanic or Latino. So the number 1, the composition index of 1, is comparing the percent of enrolled students to the percent of students who have received a suspension or expulsion. So that would be a composition index close to 1. Let's take another example. So if we look at Black and African American students, you'll see here that our African American students and Black students represent about 4.6% of the total school population. If we look at all suspension and expulsions, African American students represent 10.13% of all students who received a suspension or an expulsion. So the composition index of 2.17 is the comparison between the percent of enrolled students and the percent of students who received a suspension or expulsion. So the composition index of 2 means that they were excluded at a rate twice of what they represent in the overall student population.
And Kelly, I just sent everyone on the webinar a link to a resource on our website that helps explain the calculation.
Thank you, Susan. That's very helpful. Composition index can be complicated, but when looking at these data, you can see here that we do have disparities across the state when we look at student discipline by race and ethnicity, when we look at student discipline by disability, and by other student groups. So it's important to keep in mind that research shows that these disparities may not necessarily be caused by differences in student behavior or poverty. So these disparities warrant serious attention and necessitate that school districts dig deeper into their data to uncover the root causes for those disparities within their own data, to ensure it's not the result of discrimination, and to put steps in place to implement practices that promote equity and discipline while keeping students in school.
a good moment for a few questions that have come in, Kelly, or?
Sure.
Sure. We've had a question about the number of students that are displayed in a subgroup, and I'm going to rely on our senior analyst, Lance Cisco, here to answer that question. So how many students in a subgroup need there be to be displayed in these analytics?
To be displayed, there need to be at least 10 students enrolled within a subgroup.
Okay, and so if that was quiet over the mic, 10 students enrolled within a subgroup in order to be displayed in the analytics. Those students are included in the state totals, though.
Correct. Even if the data are suppressed at a district level, all of those students are included in any state level report.
Thank you, Lance.
Thank you, Susan. And I also wanted to note here that on the analytic tool, there is an overview tab here at the top, and that's where you will see some of the answers to these questions, including details about what Lance just mentioned. So student groups with fewer than 10 students enrolled are not displayed, and you can find that information here in the business rules, along with more information about calculations and more details. Any other questions, Susan?
We have had some general questions come in, which I think I will, as far as to future data and breakdowns, we might as well tackle those now. So can we break the data down by school district? And at this point, we do not. We do have that. What did I say? School district, school building, by school. Thank you. And our challenge with that, especially with discipline and the student groups, are that a lot of the data ends up being suppressed because of the smaller number of students. So we do have plans to provide districts the ability to dive down deeper into school building level. Lance, anything you want to add to that? Okay. All righty. So, and when will the breakdown, or when will 16-17 data be loaded into the system? So that data is still being collected from districts. There is an input and cleanup process, correction process that goes through before the data is verified. So we don't have that on the schedule just yet. So we will be in touch with you, and we appreciate having your emails available to us. And so we will keep you posted on the timelines for the 16-17 data, both for this and for other of the performance indicators. And let's see. Does the district analytics include data about students K to 12?
Yes, I do.
Yep.
Yes.
So good clarification that Josh says. We don't currently display grade level. However, that is another enhancement that we are entertaining for future versions of the analytics. Fair statement, crew? All right. All right, some good questions coming in. Let's see. At that point, Kelly, why don't you go ahead and I will look at these other ones that are coming in.
All right, thank you, Susan. So we just talked about measuring disproportionality using the composition index. So now let's talk about measuring progress. So one way to view progress is to look at how our school districts are progressing towards both of our goals, which are to reduce the overall discipline rate for all students, as well as to eliminate disparities in the use of suspensions and expulsions. This is where we have a tab in the Tableau tool to compare discipline rate versus composition index, including all school districts in the state. Okay, so we're back to the analytics on the website. So at the top here, you can see a tab that says rate versus composition index. And right now, the subgroup here that is selected is low-income students. We will keep it at that for now. And the school year is 2016. So if you remember, we shared that a composition index of 1, which is this line here, represents that the discipline for students in this particular subgroup is proportional to the rate that that group represents in the overall student population. So you see here the x-axis, the horizontal axis here shows the composition index for the selected group, which here we're looking at low-income students. This axis here, the y-axis, shows all student discipline rate. So this is not the discipline rate for low-income students. This is the discipline rate for all students, because we want to see school districts lower the overall student discipline rate and have a composition index as close to 1 as they can get. So here you can hover over school districts who are close to this composition index of 1, but have a lower overall suspension or expulsion rate. So this rate, or this bar here, shows the average discipline rate across the state. So if we want to look at districts who have lower than average discipline rate, but close to a composition index of 1, we can hover over and see which districts are represented there. And in that box, you can see the data that show how those numbers are calculated. And this is where the filter box that Josh mentioned earlier can be very helpful. So school districts, as well as others who are looking at this data, might want to filter by what we call like districts. So they might want to find a district that is similar to them to see if, similar to them demographically, to see if they can find districts that seem to have good practices in place that they might want to learn from. So for example, if you are looking at, if you have a school district that has a higher percentage of free or students that receive free or reduced price meals, let's look at other districts that have larger percentages of students who have free and reduced price meals. So let's look at districts who have between 50% and 100% of all districts or of all students receiving free or reduced price meals. That lowers the number of districts here, so it's a little easier to take a look at who is close to these lines. And you can hover again over the districts who are close to a composition index of 1 and have a lower suspension rate. You can do this by different student group. You can also limit the data by ESD, and you can also look at different exclusion types. So if you just want to focus on long-term suspensions or expulsions, for example, you can do that as well. As we drill down into the data, we can also look at the number of days students are excluded and whether that varies by student group. So for example, for short-term suspensions, which are any suspensions 10 days or fewer, the average number of days that students are short-term suspended is 2.5 days. And the number of days on average that students receive a long-term suspension, which is any suspension over 10 days, is 27.5 days. So let's take a look at the tool to figure out where to find that. Okay, so at the top, there is a tab called Exclusion Days. Under Exclusion Type, here you can see that we're looking at short-term suspensions. And if we scroll down, you can see that the average days, average exclusion days for all students, 2.5 days for short-term suspensions, and you can see how that compares between student groups. If we scroll back up and select a long-term suspension, you can see here the long-term suspension, the average exclusion days is 27.6, and you can see how that compares between student groups. You can also dig into the data by looking at behavior type. I'll show you a few different tabs where you can take a look at that. So for example, in the district detail tab, you can look at different discipline rates by behavior type. So let's look at alcohol, for example. See all the different behavior types there. And you can compare the behavior proportion. So talk about that more later. You can see the number of students who were excluded with exclusion type compared to this particular behavior across the state. And you can see how that compares again between student groups. And many of the tabs you can also select by behavior. So if we look at the gap tab, for example, this again shows data by 4 years. And again, it's showing the student behavior of alcohol compared by different student groups. So this is comparing, for example, low-income students to students who are not low income. And you can select different student groups here as well. So let's look at gender, for example, and the difference in how students are suspended or how many students are suspended for alcohol between student groups. There is also a tab at the top that says Compare All Behaviors. And this shows here by year. So the different color bars here are for different school years, which you can see here at the bottom. And it shows you how the behaviors of students were suspended for by year. So for example, let's look at other behavior resulting in an intervention. So in 2013, you can see that 52% of all suspensions and expulsions were in this catch-all category for other behavior. But as OSPI implemented more specific categories of student behaviors, you can see this number steadily decreasing. So in 2013, 52% of all behaviors or all suspensions were for the category of other behavior. But then in 2014, that decreased to 50%. 2015, that decreased to 35%. And in 2016, that decreased to just over 27%. You can also compare behaviors by student group. So for example, at the top, we can select different student groups, for example, special education. And you can see, you can compare behavior types that students in special education received a suspension or expulsion for. You can also select by school year. So this compares the school years that we have this data for, but let's select 2015-16 here at the top. And then it's easier to compare for this particular year how students who are in special education received suspensions, expulsions for which behavior category. So behavior proportion here means that, for example, for violence without major injury, 10% of all suspensions and expulsions for students in special education were for this particular behavior type. So if we add up all of the different behavior types that we have, that should add up to 100% of all suspensions and expulsions. So once a school district digs into their data, they can take steps to discover the root causes of any issues they've uncovered, such as their disparities or high discipline rates. We encourage districts to review their discipline, their school district and school discipline policies, student handbooks, and discipline practices. We encourage districts in discovering root causes to talk with teachers and administrators about their experiences and challenges, and talk with students and families about their experience as well. We have plenty of resources online to help school districts conduct this root cause analysis and take their next steps. Once school districts identify the root causes of their disparities or high discipline rates, they can create an action plan. This could include a review and a revision of their district policies and codes of conduct to make sure all definitions and behaviors for which students can be disciplined are clear and non-discriminatory. Make sure all consequences are clear for students, are developmentally appropriate, and are proportional to the behavior. And make sure that due process protections are provided to the student, such as notice, an opportunity for the student to share their perspective, and an opportunity to appeal the decision to suspend or expel the student. We also encourage districts to consider evidence-based strategies to prevent behavior challenges and consider alternatives to suspension. Josh will talk about that a bit more later. And consider how teachers will be supported through changes in district policies, procedures, or practices. Next, districts should put that plan into action while considering what are the goals and expectations. How are staff going to be informed and trained, especially if the district is taking steps to implement alternatives to suspension, for example, restorative practices, or implement positive behavioral interventions and support? And what resources do they need to carry out that plan, such as funding or staff?
And Callie, we've had a question come in that when there is a higher discipline rate by a school district, what are they required to do?
So the main laws that school districts are required to follow when it comes to discipline rates is our civil rights administrative rules, which are in Washington Administrative Code, or the WAC, and it's 392-190-048, which was on a slide earlier. And it does not necessarily require that districts take steps if they have a high discipline rate, but it does require that if districts find disproportionality in their discipline rates, they are required to take steps to ensure it's not the result of discrimination.
Thank you.
I'm just going to talk shortly and briefly about some of the resources that OSPI provides and encourages districts to utilize in supporting students in discipline and behavior. And a multi-tiered system of supports is one of those frameworks for the delivery of services and interventions that OSPI strongly encourages districts to look to, and that can facilitate that cycle of inquiry in the Plan, Do, Study, Act to a greater extent within a framework than if it were done on just kind of ad hoc basis and not within an overall systemic approach. And this includes not just support for behavior, but for all academic and non-academic supports for students. For a lot more information on multi-tiered system of supports, you can go to the website there and also review some of the work the MTSS Advisory Committee at OSPI has been engaged in doing. For studying and progress monitoring how your plan is going, that involves necessarily disaggregating data, and like we said, the state discipline is a starting point for the analytics, but districts and schools can get into much more granular detail at the local level of what might be going on in evaluating how they're implementing their plan. So we'll just repeat it over and over again that reducing the overall use of exclusionary practices doesn't necessarily mean that you're reducing disparities in discipline between groups of students, or that you're even necessarily supporting the academic and social emotional learning of students and improving academic outcomes. If your goal is simply to stop doing something and not put in positive supports and plans and practices to replace the negative impacts. And that's where acting in response to what you've evaluated and learned along the way is important, and repeating this cycle of inquiry to really understand, is it more time that's needed before just assuming that the practice you might be implementing is the problem? Maybe the practice is great, but you need more time, more personnel, more professional learning for your staff, or you need to add in review additional strategies, or you need to integrate all your strategies and practices into a comprehensive systemic system of supports, like I mentioned before. We're just going to go over briefly some updates and resources to look to. As most of you should know by now, in 2016, the legislature passed a comprehensive bill based on the recommendations of the Educational Opportunity Oversight and Accountability Committee. And Part 1 of that bill made some significant changes to student discipline in addressing disproportionality in student discipline, and made these significant changes. For more information on the details of this bill and requirements, you can go to the Student Discipline webpage. OSPI released some bulletins in response to this bill, and is also currently engaged in rulemaking, and has been over the course of the last year, following expedited rulemaking in response to 1541. OSPI is continuing to improve the discipline rules to provide additional clarity and improve the readability and accessibility of the OSPI student discipline rules. This bill also directed OSPI to develop discipline training modules to support implementation of discipline policies and procedures. And the current plan is for these modules to become available during this upcoming school year. So for more information on the timeline for both of these, you can subscribe to the Student Discipline webpage for updates, or contact one of us for more information. We also have the OSPI behavior menu of best practices and strategies available online, which is updated on an annual basis. The latest version was just updated in May, which included updates to the entry on restorative justice and trauma-informed approaches, and significant updates to the family engagement entry, as well as a new entry on kindergarten transitions. And I will mention that the companion menus are the ELA and math menus of best practices and strategies, which you can find all through the Learning Assistance Program page. And when you're talking about behavior and discipline, as I mentioned briefly before, it may be academic or non-academic needs that need to be addressed when holistically looking at a systemic approach to what goes on in student outcomes in your schools. I think Susan is going to jump in and talk about some OSPI partnerships.
Thank you, Josh. So OSPI works closely with the ESD network using these performance indicators to help districts understand the equity in student outcomes and to support districts with the strategies. Using the cycle of inquiry process that Callie referred to earlier, we hold work sessions to go through that, using data to help inform what is happening, and then to also provide strategies for districts in the practice. And so it's both understanding the data, using the data, and then also working with the data quality. And so a couple of questions that have come through the chat line are, what is in that other category? So that's a good example of the data quality issues that we work with. As you'll see on that other category, it has significantly decreased over the last 4 years, and that is a part of work looking at what is reported there, creating other categories to report if it's determined that that's a significant category to track, and to try to understand what is being reported there so that we don't have a large number of reporting where we don't understand why students are being excluded. So OSPI's partnerships, working with the ESDs, working with the districts, is building our capacity to improve our decision making and improve that data quality. We also work in partnership with the professional learning leadership organizations, such as, there's a flock of letters up there. So these are our superintendents, these are our principal associations, the school directors, you'll see the ESDs there. So we work together to make sure that our focus on equity is organized and that we are supporting each other in these efforts. So you will see all of us in this alliance as we present our conferences, as we present regional workshops, as we present webinars, working together and to be able to increase our communication and to organize our efforts on reducing the opportunity gap. And let me just check. So that there was also a question that came in about how do we assure that the data that is being reported is accurate. And so there are a number of different efforts. So when I talked about the other category, we are examining data and looking for anomalies. There is also part of the review process, and you don't really call it an audit per se. Callie, do you want to comment on that, on as far as data accuracy at all?
Yeah, and I don't know, it doesn't necessarily speak to data accuracy as much as it does monitoring to make sure that school districts are complying with the civil rights requirements for student discipline. So we do, at OSPI, we monitor every school district to make sure that they do have a process in place to just aggregate their data, review that data at least on an annual basis to identify and address disparities. And we also look to make sure that they're doing that at the building level as well. So when we take a look at building level data reviews, as well as what we see at districts is reviewing, we can compare that to OSPI's analytics to make sure that if, for example, they aren't finding disparities, but we see disparities in OSPI's analytics, we can confirm that information with what school districts are sharing with us.
Thank you, Callie. And here's a question. Has there been analysis done on whether teacher diversity impacts the discipline outcomes for students of color?
As far as the research that supports that, yes. Is OSPI engaged in doing that type of research? No. There's some capacity within OSPI's role to look at teacher diversity in the workplace and to provide resources and support to teachers. But really that type of root cause analysis is what we try to support districts in doing, because they can be much more effective in identifying, for example, drilling down, looking at office discipline referrals. Who are they coming from? What students are being sent? Then they can identify, does this teacher need more additional professional learning? Or is there maybe something going on with the student-teacher relationship between particular students and a teacher in the classroom that could be addressed through restorative interventions or otherwise? So I think that's kind of a brief answer to the question.
All righty. And while we have you at the mic here, Josh, is positive behavior support included in the behavior menu of best practices?
Not as a specific entry, but as a framework, and that there's a section in the menu on multi-tiered system of supports and integrated student supports that addresses how PBIS can be integrated again within a larger system to support the delivery of the types of practices and strategies that are contained in the menu. So read through the content and you'll find PBIS mentioned throughout the menu, but within the context of that's the framework that supports the delivery of these interventions.
All righty, we have a question on when will school level data be released to districts. And so as far as the improvements to our tool and being able for districts to log in and dive down deeper. That is a longer term vision that we have. So that would not be an imminent thing. We are hoping to make some progress in the earlier part of next year. That's our hope in developing the tool. We do have capacity to provide districts with student level files that we have done for other analytics. That is a raw data file, and that is something that we will keep in touch with you on the timing of. If you're from a district and you'll get stay in contact with us, we will keep you posted on the timeline for kind of raw data of student level files at the school level. I have a number of questions on will the slides be available, and yes, they will. It will take us a little bit of time to get our ADA compliance edits into them and get them up on the web. However, after this webinar, you will receive a follow-up email, and you will be able to request a advanced copy of the slides, and that I can send you right away. And otherwise, in a couple weeks, there will be a recording and the slides available up on the website. We have just a minute to go here if there's any questions that anyone has before we close. All righty. So again, you'll get that email, and we look forward to working with you as we go forward. Thank you.